Welcome to Coffee, Eggs and Inspiration. It's a weekly show that goes out over YouTube and as a podcast over all of the major channels. And each week I get to sit with an inspiring person and listen to them tell their story and then share it with all of you. This week is no different. I'm joined by Chris Munro. Welcome, Chris.
Hi, Craig.
Chris is an Academy Award winning sound mixer. He's worked on over 100 films. Pioneered the first digital soundtrack to the James Bond movies. Worked on 5 of the James Bond movies in the franchise there. Worked on many of the Marvel movies. He's won Oscars, Academy Awards for Black Hawk Down in 2001, for Gravity in 2013, BAFTAs for Casino Royale in 2006, and also for Gravity in 2013. And been nominated for several as well. The Mummy in 1999, Captain Phillips in 2013, and nominated for a BAFTA in the movie United 93, a story about one of the aircraft in 9/11. Chris has worked alongside names like Stephen Spielberg, Ridley Scott, Ron Howard, and many, many others. And an incredible career. And I know, Chris, that you're as busy as you've ever been. I don't know how you do it, but let's start by winding the clock back and tell us how you got into the industry.
Okay, well, I started such a long time ago. I'm working on Mission Impossible right now, but back then I started when I was 16 years old in the studio as a trainee, not really knowing what I was getting into and not necessarily really knowing I was getting into sound. I was just absolutely mad about films. I'd grown up in North London, in not a tall and affluent family, and I'd always had a big interest in the cinema. I suppose part of that was because we didn't have a television until I was probably 9 or 10. So I wasn't used to having television. So I was very used to going to the cinema with my mother. My mother would take me to the cinema. She was an avid reader. So she would take me along to the library and she'd pick up like 6 books or however she was allowed to borrow, and she would read all those in a few days. And very often the trip to the library would also involve a trip to the cinema. The cinema was very close to the library. And so I kind of, that was kind of my thing, was going to the cinema and loving the cinema from a very early age. The library is also kind of interesting because whilst my mother was choosing her books, I'd wander around and look at different stuff and bits and pieces. And I found that you could look at electronics magazines. There was electronics magazines out then, which was practical electronics, practical wireless. And, think about, we're talking now about the very kind of early 60s. Yeah. And it was the start of the transistor and the start of that kind of technology. And so I started to read these magazines and then got inspired by the idea that you could build your own kits, build your own radio, build all this kind of stuff. And so electronics became an interest as well. And it wasn't until, I tried to get into the film industry. I knew from a really early age it's what I wanted to do, film or television. And I tried, but it was heavily unionized. And they had this whole thing there, you couldn't get a job unless you were a member of the union. You couldn't be a member of the union unless you had a job. A catch-22. But I didn't give in, even when at school we had a careers master who virtually laughed at me when I said I wanted to work in films. And I told he knew that I had this interest in technology and in electronics and so on and so forth. And he told me that, the school has very good contacts with this company called Lanson that do these tubes, these air tubes that they used to have to take messages around department stores. And he thought there was a real future in that. I mean, even at 15, I knew there was no future in that, and that those days had passed. I by sheer chance, I also had an interest in cars, habit which sadly I still have a problem with, is collecting objects. And I used to help out in a petrol station at the weekends. And in those days, very often petrol was served. It wasn't self-service everywhere. And so this particular garage, you know, the petrol was served. So I used to serve petrol on a weekend. And a guy came in this weekend, and I filled him up with petrol, and he was about to drive out, and his car wouldn't start. And he said, "Oh, what's wrong with my car? It can't start. Can you take a look at it?" And I said, "Well, you know, I can't take a look at it. You know, I'm only here to fill to do the you know, the petrol. I can't really look at your car." And I said, "I think I know what's wrong with it, but you know, I can't really touch it." And he said, "Oh, you know, I've got to get to the studio, you know, and I'm going to be really late." And of course, as soon as he said studio, kind of rang bells. "Oh, the studio? Yeah, really? Yeah, what studio is that?" He told me Elm Street Studios. So I said, "Well, maybe I'll take a look at your car for you." And I knew exactly what it was. It was like a bad earth on the starter motor, and I fixed it in about 4 minutes. And he made the big mistake of giving me his business card. And then I drove him crazy, trying to get a job as like an apprentice or something in the studio. And eventually he said, "Oh, well, look, you know what? There is a job going, but the only job, it's in sound. And unfortunately, they need someone that understands about electronics." I said, "That's me. I know a lot about transistors and all." And he said, "Oh, really?" Yeah. You know, it's like one of my hobbies. Anyway, so he fixed me to go for an interview. I went along to the interview, and as it turned out, the person who was a really kindly kind of older gentleman who interviewed me, he knew all about valves and so on, but very little about transistors and that kind of thing. So I quickly realized that the questions he was asking me to test me, I knew much more about than he did. And so he offered me the job, and he said, "When can you start?" I said, "Well, I can start Monday." And so, okay, you've got the job. What I didn't do was tell my parents that I was leaving school at the age of 16. I'd been fairly good at school. I'd taken my exams a year early and done quite well. And they had expected me to stay on at school and so on and so forth. So I told my parents that I was doing a summer job. And it wasn't until it got to kind of September, when the school called up to see where I was, that they realized, of course, I wasn't going back to school. I was going to work.
Wow, what a story. And it's been a very long summer, hasn't it, Chris?
It's been a long summer, exactly.
Amazing. You're known as an innovator. You know, if you're a student of the industry, you're well known as pushing the boundaries and being one of the first to adopt new technology. And of course, the technology is moving even more rapidly, you know, in the last 10 years than it probably did in the first 10 years of your career. What are some of your proudest moments as an innovator? Can you talk about an example there?
Yeah, well, perhaps the first James Bond film that I did, which was Tomorrow Never Dies, they had previously made all of their films in analog. And I was, part of my brief was to come on and to convert it to digital. And that's not just a quality thing. It's because, you know, as you well know, digital technology gives you much more ease of manipulation and allows you to automate things. So I think we went from something like a 26-week post-production period on that Bond film to, I think, a 14-week post-production. Wow. Which is a big difference for a Bond film. It changed the way Bond films were made. It also changed the way that, I think previous to that, there was a period when lots of films, all the sound was very often done in post-production. There wasn't necessarily that thing where people were interested in having original direct sound. But that was a time when audiences were then becoming much more demanding and expected direct sound. And so something that digital technology also brought to Bond movies was recording direct sound and having sound which would be not replaced in post-production, not dubbed.
Right, which is, you know, just seems normal these days. You say it changed the way Bond movies were filmed. How so?
Well, because as I say, that very often there was a kind of a school of thought that directors could improve the performance later on in post-production because they revoiced everything, they dubbed everything later. They would often have a belief that they could improve the performance later. Often what happened is you lost a lot of the truth of the movie. You lost a lot of the believability of movies. And I think when you've got something which is outlandish like Bond or Mission Impossible, as I'm working on now, you need a certain amount of truth in it to make it work as well. And like we're speaking now, a lot of there's a different kind of perception of how we speak if we're only hearing sound and if we see picture as well, because a lot of our communications are very much in our faces, in our expressions, and it's very easy for people to forget that. But when you start to change from original sound to dubbed sound, you realize that there is that slight difference. It doesn't necessarily still retain the truth.
Yeah, I suppose so. I mean, you form your words, don't you? Partially using the body language, and so I guess you used to film I guess the dialogue happened live in real time. But am I right in saying that the actors then re-recorded their voices over the same lines?
That used to happen a lot up until kind of the 70s. I would think most films, whenever they went outside of the studio, they would replace the sound.
Wow.
In the studio, and actors would dub themselves.
Interesting. So twice as big a job, perhaps, for the actor.
And in fact, I remember, at one point on Italian movies, for instance, they used to not like if ever they were because they dubbed everything. They used to like it to be slightly out of sync, so that you could tell that it had been replaced, because only low budget films that couldn't afford to dub would use direct sound. So it's kind of...
Oh my goodness, how interesting. What are the most technical, or what's the most technical thing that you've worked on as a sound mixer, Chris?
Well, I guess every film I do has some different technical aspect, and that's often what I'm employed for. Gravity was a particularly technical film. It was a different kind of film. It was a film where we had to... people think of sound as being just a separate entity to a film. There are people like George Lucas who I think says that sound is 50% of a movie. But often it isn't just what the audience perceive as sound of what we are in control of. So we deal with things like time codes and other stuff. So on Gravity, for instance, we were very responsible for making sure that the fractions of shots that we would do. Sometimes we would do shots which were 3 or 4 seconds long, and we would be responsible for making sure that the camera, the lighting, the sound, and everything all syncs together to make sure that all those seconds, everything fits together. For example, the lighting on Gravity was designed in such a way that it's very, very accurate as the actors are orbiting the Earth. The light was changing, and it was changing very, very accurately. We were also doing things on that where we decided from a very early stage. Alfonso Cuarón, the director, I know when he first met me, he said, okay, there's no sound in space, so what are you going to do? And that started to sound like something interesting and something that we could think about. And I very much thought about Sandra Bullock's breathing, and so we decided that we'd make the breathing almost like dialogue in the film. But when you're already shooting like seconds of the film, it's very, very difficult to make that have the same rhythm throughout. So we would do things where we would play Sandra Bullock a little part of her breathing from a previous shot. She would then pick up on that rhythm and move it up a pace, ready for the next shot. So even things like breathing became a very technical issue to get absolutely right and believable and accurate. And as I say, we were also gearing up all of the time codes for the camera moves, which the cameras were on robot arms, a bit like they used to build cars with. So the arms would be programmed, but we would need to make sure that all of those were in sync with the sound, with the lighting, and that's something which we as a sound department have control over.
Wow. So that is that unusual for the sound department to have control over those sorts of things?
It's kind of unusual, and it's something it's something that I took on, but it's kind of traditional that the sound department run the time code and run the synchronization.
It's an extraordinary movie, very moving and powerful. I remember it well, and I think I've seen it more than once as well. I'm curious, how do you simulate or create the sound of in a space vessel re-entering the Earth's atmosphere? Because of course that scene coming back down to Earth was pretty noisy. I mean, how do you create that sound?
Well, first of all, I should say that is a part that is mostly created in post-production, and that what I would do is to try to get the best quality sound that could be treated to give those effects. But other things that were kind of important were making it kind of real for the actors as well. That's another kind of part of our job. So what we would do, for instance, when she was in contact with other people, we would make a point of playing the different sounds in different ways, treating them in different ways, that she would hopefully think of the space station being over here, something else, the person she's speaking to, who's the fisherman, the Arctic fisherman, down here. We tried to give her some kind of feeling of direction. But also what we do is we would pre-record all of those things, all of her interactions. And I would put lines on a keyboard, and I would have lines where they would play faster and slower, different performances, so that every time I could play her the feed lines, but it would always feel fresh. It wouldn't feel like she was working with a recording.
Wow.
And I think that was very important for her. So I think a lot of a lot of an audience doesn't understand that the part of that we do as sound mixers is very much supporting the actors, trying to record the actors as best we can, trying to support them as best we can, but most importantly supporting the performance rather than influencing it.
Right.
So the important thing for us is to capture the performance as best we can, but we need to provide the tools for them to give that performance.
So many layers. What's the most memorable film for you, Chris?
Oh, probably A Fish Called Wanda.
Brilliant movie.
A Fish Called Wanda was a brilliant movie, and it was a film which we had no idea was going to be such a success. It was made for, I think, £1 million. We shot it over 6 weeks. We had a 78-year-old director who was an amazing director, Charlie Crichton, who'd made films like The Lavender Hill Mob, and he was an Ealing comedy director. He knew so much about comic timing that it was an education just to watch him work with those actors. And of course, he was so economical with his time. We shot the film, as I say, in 6 weeks. Nobody expected it to be the success it was, and we had such a lot of fun working on it.
Brilliant movie. And John Cleese, you've done a lot of work over the years with John Cleese.
I have, yeah, exactly. Yeah, I worked on Clockwise also with John Cleese and with other things, yeah.
And what's he like to work with?
Oh yeah, great. But John's very interesting because the way that he works. But he's somebody that cannot ADR. ADR is automatic dialogue replacement, which is when you replace the sound afterwards. So he just feels that never works for comedy. So he absolutely needs to make sure that the sound is always going to work.
Right.
And that's something which we have a kind of mutual trust with each other to make things work.
So it's always in the moment, and yeah.
Exactly.
Like he's doing stand-up or something. Incredible actor, and interesting. You must have seen, I mean, the technology has changed enormously. I mean, you talked about your first boss being skilled in valves that moved to transistors, that then became, moved from analog to digital, and so on. Talk about some of the changes that you've seen and what they've done to your trade.
Okay, well, when I first started, I mean, I as a kid had a 1/4-inch tape recorder. I mean, but interestingly about it, because we didn't have very much money, I'd somehow saved up to buy this tape recorder. But what used to happen was it never kept to speed very well. So you'd record something, some music or something, and as the batteries ran down, so it would run slower. So it would always have wows, whoa. So it wasn't the greatest kind of recording. I was fascinated by it, by tape recording, but it wasn't the greatest recording. And interesting, when I first started, I was just quarter-inch recording was just coming in to being used in films. They had found a way to synchronize it. When I very first started, they were actually recording sound on 35mm magnetic film, and they moved over to quarter-inch tape. That was the first, and that was an innovation, and that was something which was very good for me as a youngster, because again, I knew about this transistor technology. It was technology I understood, and so you know, I could be helpful to the more experienced engineers that were there, and there was a great kind of exchange of engineers, you know, of ideas, that I had some technical knowledge that I could kind of use, and of course they had the experience. And I see exactly the same with kids. You know, I'm very keen on having trainees and mentoring, you know, because I find, for me, having youngsters working with me, I get so much from them, and it's like why I so love mentoring, because it's a two-way street. It's not a one-way street. You know, working together in any kind of mentoring program. If you've got someone that's smart and bright and young and has new ideas, it's great for the mentor, and it's something which I really so enjoy.
Can you give any examples of something that you've learned recently from one of your mentees?
Oh, well, you know, just I get it all the time. I mean, okay, on Black Widow, I was very interested in using some kind of ASMR technology for the sound. I just had this idea about using ASMR, but I got that idea really from kids that I'm working with who watch that kind of stuff, and it's not something that I knew very much about. So I started to talk about it to them, and they were kind of interested. They had questions about ASMR, and then I started to research it, and I met you know,
Talisa.
YouTubers who Talisa, exactly, and you know, we've become good friends because we've actually exchanged a lot of ideas, you know, with the way that she has used these ASMR sounds, and also the technology that I feel can be used to record them better.
Yeah, a very interesting connection there. So Talisa Tossell, big YouTuber. I'll link her below. She does mostly slime videos, which are also quite sonically rich. You know, it's a sensory toy, but she's got some ASMR stuff there. An amazing meeting of worlds, indeed.
And it's important, you know, because particularly working on things like Marvel movies, you know, that's you know, it's very important that we can all connect with the audience, and so it's vital to know what people are watching, what people are interested in, and that's why I'm also so interested in YouTube and looking at YouTube creators and looking at what people are doing, and I'm fascinated how there's this interest in things which might not about content. They might not necessarily be the made in the best quality, but the content is important and it's interesting and it's rich, and that kind of goes back also to audio, because now we're very, very used to MP3 music, to listening to MP3 music. But if you go back to my youth, where we had hi-fi 33 1/3 albums and actually much better quality audio, but it was harder to manage. It wasn't as accessible. If you couldn't afford to buy the album, then you couldn't have that. Now what we have is, what we traded is quality for accessibility, and I think that's very interesting. How accessibility, you know, is there for everyone, and you don't have so much. I hope you don't have so much of a restriction of not being able to afford access.
Yeah, it's easier for sort of more ubiquitous, I suppose. Do you have a really high-end audio system at home? Are you quite particular in your personal consumption?
do you know what? You know, they say, what is it? A cobbler's children go unshod. Yeah, no, I don't. I have an okay system. You know, one of the things that I have to do as part of being an Academy member is that I watch a lot of movies, and I usually go to screenings to watch them. And at the moment, what's happening is because of COVID, you know, I'm having to watch a lot of those movies at home, streaming or whatever, or I won't see them. And so I have an okay system, but I don't actually have an amazing system.
Isn't that interesting? Well, you know, honestly, Chris, it feels like I'm talking to an enthusiastic, energetic 16-year-old still, totally driven by your curiosity and innovation and devouring these new technologies and using them in different ways. There may be people watching here who are thinking about a career in the movies, or taking their next step. The people who were, you know, in your place back when you were serving at the petrol station. What advice would you have for them?
I think the advice I would have is that, you know, you need to not necessarily start off and say, I'm going to be a director or I'm going to be a producer. I think it's important to realize that there are lots of different parts, different facets of movie making, and enjoying those and being a part of those and enjoying each step on the way doesn't stop you from becoming a director. I mean, I've actually directed and written films myself because I have this great interest in films as a whole, and I've probably described myself as a filmmaker specializing in sound rather than a sound mixer specializing in film. And I would say to them, look at all these different aspects of what might interest you. Editing, for instance. Editing is such a great place to learn about filmmaking, and some of our best directors have come, people like David Lean, have come from being editors. And so I think it's good to look at different steps along the way and try to be absolutely the best at each of those steps.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's so true, isn't it? For the layperson, it's easy to focus on the director or the actors that you see on the screen, but actually there's a huge team in industry, you know, from costume and set design to sound to editing, as you say, and many, many others, and lots of entry points there that may be really interesting and good starting points. I'm talking to a man at the top of his game. You're as busy as ever, and you're a real inspiration. Chris Munro, thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you for inviting me.